Hi Michael, this is part two of a video podcast, which I started with on my own to set out a more general perspective on the COVID-19 crisis and its effect on Africa and the Middle East. Also set a little bit in the context of our work together for the Royal Academy of War Sciences in Sweden, on Swedish and perspectives on European security, and also related it to the global call for a ceasefire in the various conflicts put out by the UN Secretary General about it a month ago already, where many of the conflicts that he was referring to, of course, are in these regions that we are discussing now. And also referring very general terms to the report on the southern dimension that we together have produced and which we are now going to update in the summer, following what we know in addition about the COVID crisis effects and other developments. So what I promised our listeners and viewers in the first video was that I would ask you to, as a former Swedish ambassador to Turkey and also envoy to Sudan and so on, having followed these regions for a very long time, to help us to situate the potential impact of the crisis in relation to the other problems we already described in our report, both in terms of war spilling over to Europe, in terms of flow security problems, both good and bad flows. We have an oil crisis going on and so forth, but more specifically related to some of the cases that we were referring to. And I will leave it to you to go through the cases, and I will put in questions as we go along, but it would be good, and I will then later illustrate these with references to the most important data that you will be referring to. So over to you, Michael, to start off.
Thank you. When I listened to the Secretary General of the UN saying as he should, that there should be a general halt to the conflicts of the world because of the coronavirus problem, of course, my reflection then is, since I've been around for a while, that this is a constant message from the UN headquarters, the symbol of multilateralism, and to less and less avail in recent days. So I am honestly afraid that the words from Mr. Guterres now will not be heeded very much now, as little as his words have been, and his predecessors' words have been heeded before. Because simply saying there should be no more wars is not good enough in a world of realpolitik. But fine, and I welcome his words, but I don't expect much to happen as a result of that. So that's the first note of realpolitik in a way. On the other hand, there are some signs, as we have seen, and as you have pointed out also on various occasions, of parties to a conflict at least trying to sort out things or put a halt to their conflicts, facing the common enemy of a pandemic. Now, have you seen such traits or features in Yemen, for example? To some extent, although not very seriously, as far as I can tell, in Syria. The world tends to be ticking on, and the COVID-19 factor seems to be a disrupting factor, adding to the other disrupting factors. So it is almost always such that the equilibriums creating the world are so vulnerable to disruptions, and COVID clearly is one of them. You asked me to look into cases, and let me then start in Libya. As we remember from when we worked on our report and whatever else, Libya is an extraordinary case of ambivalent and shaky international behavior, with many actors, increasing numbers of actors, being increasingly confused about what are the achievable goals on the part of all of them. What we have seen in the last year, and everything one can say about Libya tends only to be exacerbated by the COVID factor. You had the refugee aspect and the fear on the part of European countries, especially Italy and other southern European countries, of a flow of migrants coming via Libyan territory, and Libya because of the instability generally of the country as a result of developments after the fall of Gaddafi. By the way, now you see one of the sons of Gaddafi somehow emerging as a possible new leader when the health problems of Haftar be a factor which will be decisive. So it is only one of the ironic aspects of Libya. But the general chaos situation and the futile efforts on the part of the UN to have a grip with support of the main actors in the UN, in the Security Council, for a multilateral peace plan to be working, has clearly become disrupted by bipolarization between two parties. So out of chaos comes a bipolar situation, and it hasn't been improved at all in recent months. And as a result of the COVID factor, there is so much fear also of a connection between the COVID factor and the refugee factor on the part of European perceptions. So I haven't seen any improvement there, but I have seen a lot of complicating developments further as a result of COVID, and nothing so far has been displayed to show that there is a spirit of cooperation under the common threat of the coronavirus. Not yet. So if we move from Libya, where of course the biggest question is, will in the end Russian diplomatic successes be the lasting feature of the developments there? Russia having sought a permanent presence in North Africa for a long time and may be successful unless the US decides to act against it. So leaving Libya aside, and then moving to the case of Eastern Mediterranean and Cyprus. There, I think that the trend, the most recent trend, to some extent affected by the coronavirus, is one of dampening the conflict level. There is, under the coronavirus threat, less activities in the oil and gas drilling area, which in turn has somehow reduced the acuteness of the Cyprus question, and generally the conflict between one grouping of countries, namely Israel, Egypt, Cyprus, Greece, as against Turkey and Turkey's interest, Turkey with its long coast facing the Eastern Mediterranean, but with the festering Cyprus problem always being a hindrance. I have seen generally that under the coronavirus problem, there has been a tendency for the parties to this particular conflict, a tendency for an emerging, for an accelerating problematic evolving there to be dampened by the corona factor. Generally because of reduced levels of activities in this area, somehow shelving the conflict to some extent. It can also be a factor of the fact that Putin's and his Russia and his plans in this region connected with his involvement in the Syria crisis area that these activities somehow are also dampened by or reduced by his own coronavirus problem, which is emerging fast. At the same time that Turkey has now evolved to a country, the biggest corona case country in the world outside Western Europe and the US. Turkey having now 107,000 cases. Fewer deaths than other main corona countries, but still a huge number. So countries such as France, such as Italy, of course, such as Russia, and such as Turkey, somehow are preoccupied with their own coronavirus problem to make them preoccupied from being too activist on their foreign policy agendas. So maybe I can conclude there for it. Sorry?
Is lockdown actually then preventing some of these conflicts to become further aggravated? Or?
Yeah, in the sense that it tends, if you have a coronavirus problem and you need to defend against it, and you take recourse to lockdowns, which in turn has enormous economic consequences. So it tends, I mean, this sequence of events and sequence, if you like, of threats tends to preoccupy states from being very activist on their foreign policy agendas, I would say. But it's, again, it's one of the things that where the jury is still out, and we cannot decide for sure. It can also, in other scenarios, serve as an accelerator. You cannot say, because it's determined by how states define their interests in relation to those conflicts. For example, you can easily imagine that even with the corona factor at play, things in Syria can accelerate badly, depending on how it is played. But overall, and at present, I would say that the net outcome is one where everyone, all players, realize that the coronavirus can be a factor, making handling of the pre-existing problems practically impossible, and therefore advise against acting other than with caution, because of the degree of preoccupation with the virus problem. If you take, for example, Afghanistan, can imagine there, although still we haven't seen the enormous disruptive consequences of a major outbreak in countries such as Afghanistan, but with the levels of conflict there, and you can imagine what harm the coronavirus threat could be. It's very, very difficult to foresee, but I can imagine that perhaps there can be a certain element of moderation on the part of main players.
On the Afghan issue, we don't know too much yet, but what we heard is that many Afghans who are in Iran have left and gone back to Afghanistan, have been more or less forced to go back, and some of them most likely are infected. And we have a very low capacity for testing in Afghanistan. We have heard that the president himself has been in some sort of quarantine. There is a general, of course, lockdown, not only in terms of the virus, but also in political terms between the two contenders for power in Afghanistan. So it is indeed a very complex situation, and the question is whether the Americans would just leave things as they are and just forget about Afghanistan, even in this aggravated situation. But it could also, as you indicate, go the other way, that everyone will focus on the crisis and follow the Secretary General's advice, lower down the tension now, let's come together and try to fight this. We don't know, simply. And it is simply a very, very upsetting thing that we know so little about the situation in countries like this.
Yeah. One could perhaps there again say on the note of realpolitik that if the parties would draw moderation conclusions from the situation, it may not be so much because the Secretary General says so, but that their perception of reality compels them to do so. Because the message from the UN has always been one of appeals for peace and stability. So that's not so much new. But you're right, and I am generally afraid of the COVID-19 factor providing another disruption to the already very disrupted global scene. I'm nourishing the hope that maybe facing this as facing the climate change factor will mean also in the very near future will be a compelling factor for cooperation to such an extent that has been unthinkable during the last 5-6 years. But you see, in various ways, the way the various challenges tend to connect. I'm referring now to, as you did also, the issue of mass migration. I'm afraid that the COVID threats now and the relative absence of news, whether good or bad news from the mass migration side, it's not so much that anything has been solved or settled. It's just that there is too little media attention to the persisting remaining problems, but that have caused mass migration. But you can imagine if there is a COVID factor added to the already tense conditions surrounding mass migration. If there is fear, for example, in Europe, that all those persons that would need to and deserve to be allowed to enter into Europe because their situation in Libya is completely, it's the very definition of unbearable. But if they are suspected to carry with them a coronavirus problem that could cause a second wave or something like that, it means desperation and irrationality to even to unprecedented levels. So there is a big threat, which exemplifies, I think, and I think you hinted to that, Lars-Erik, that the very notion of travel exist to be, for example, from European countries to be present in, for example, African countries to do development project works, etc., etc., and for that matter also tourism. On the one hand, and migration, Gastarbeiter, migration, asylum cases, etc., etc. All these flows in both directions can be suspected of becoming very negatively affected and also very much complicated by a corona factor, if that factor becomes a permanent feature in international relations. I mean, we have an acute crisis now, but most experts tend to think that whatever happens, and at least before we have a vaccine, we will have to live with the corona factor, with balancing the various policy goals of health protection and economic protection somehow simultaneously. You see in the US now where some states have started to open up, but taking enormous risks of it. So having to live with a corona factor for a long time still, at least, as I said.
Can I interject on that? I mean, the latest analysis I saw from an expert who has introduced the smallpox vaccine and things like that is that we are talking about a minimum period of 18 to 24 months before the vaccine, an eventual vaccine is effectively administered to world population. So it's an enormously long period. Yeah.
And we are also face the real risk that even if and when that happens, you could say it's unbelievable that it should have to take so long time, but we have to accept facts here. But there could be a new pandemic following on the coronavirus now. Most experts seem to think that this is the world has become so vulnerable to all sorts of pandemic threats, and we have seen several in the last 10-15 years. So this would indicate that facing the risk of pandemics will be one rather permanent feature of international relations, which will force upon itself adaptation to these realities. And in that you have also to somehow build in some kind of new rationality to international relations, having made such adaptations, working more with digital means, communicate more, sending money instead of personnel. And what about tourism? We don't know that yet, but I mean the whole the economics of globalization in a way will at least have to adapt. Yeah. And of course, you and I have no clue what will come out of this, because no one really knows.
No, but one can assume that when it comes to development aid, for instance, and various types of interventions in outside Europe, there will be a great deal of hesitation, and people will be worried that things cannot be properly audited and controlled. And this also probably goes for commercial transactions, that you are not able on site, so to say, to control that things are being produced in other countries actually fulfill the standards that you have asked for, etc. So I think this is going to raise questions which might slow down international cooperation to a considerable extent. What we didn't talk about so much earlier, but which is also a new factor, is of course the oil price as well. And how do you see the combination of the COVID-19 and particularly on effect on Iran, but also now on Iraq, together with the problem of the oil price situation? To what extent can one say that this is some people have said in the media that this is an existential threat to Iraq as a nation, even that you have they are so enormously dependent on the oil income. How do you see this?
Well, I see this as enormously important, because the two things tend to coincide and reinforce each other. The anti-COVID measures under the conditions of uncertainty and unpredictability, as we have seen, and with the enormous unpredictability of developments in the US, for example. And then you add the oil price thing, and a low price is good for in the consumer end perhaps, but it is generally disruptive to the international economic system. We have our neighboring Norway, a welfare state in Northern Europe, with all the advantages of any country historically. But it is affected enormously. I saw in yesterday's newspaper an article about how the oil price plus the COVID things are affecting Norway's economy. We, of course, as neighbors, hope to be able to give a helping hand or cooperate with Norway in order to help us both survive or live through this. But even a country like Norway is affected. And if you compare that to Iraq, for example, Iraq is almost entirely dependent on oil income for the functioning of the state. I think that the millions of state employees that Iraq needs in order both to try to recover from all its disasters from 2003 and onwards, or before if you include the Saddam Hussein time and its disasters, and to think about the oil income being the sole financing source of an army of state employees which are needed in order to rebuild the country and continue to fight the IS, etc., etc. So I don't see at all how Iraq can survive as a state unless this is changed, or unless, of course, it is heavily supported by some outside source, multilaterally through the IMF or whatever, or bilaterally in its cooperation with Iran or the US, given its balancing. But it's not just Iraq, but it's mainly Iraq. But all those countries that are dependent to a high degree on their oil income, Gulf states, Venezuela, all those countries, Libya. But the function of the oil price on conflicts, there I'm a little bit unsure how to see it, because take Libya, for example. The fact that the oil price is so low that the international demand for and competition about the Libyan oil resources that are somehow being blocked now by conflict. How does that work? Does the low price mean that the reduced demand means that the oil factor is less of a driver of conflict in Libya? It's hard to decide. It is so linked. But the oil price factor, also frankly, about Russia, oil and gas resources on which Putin, the president, is so dependent. You can see it play out in reduced policy energy levels of Russia in the Eastern Mediterranean, as we said before. So it is a disruptor. It is in combination with COVID. It works as a great complicator of the world scene generally. So one cannot underestimate, but see that in combination with the economic impact of COVID. Yeah.
So 1.5 more comments I propose for this podcast. One about Israel and the Gaza Strip and Hamas, which I think is important. And another, we can't say much about North Korea, but one can guess that there may be problems also there related to COVID that have led to the speculations that we are talking about, we've seen in the media the last days. Maybe you want to say a few words about each topic.
Yeah. Well, about North Korea, I'm of course curious about the health of the leader. There have been reporting, as we have seen. It's unclear what happens there. But if COVID becomes a major factor in North Korea, it is.
Could he be in quarantine?
Sorry?
Could he be in quarantine? Could that be a reason?
Could be. I don't know the answer to that. I'm just a little bit nervous about how politically fragile country like North Korea, because its system is so vulnerable to any change, and it needs for survival to maintain a level of repression that is almost uncomparable. Maybe the sister is biding her time in order to be the replacement. We'll see. And she seems to be a smart lady, but I don't know that. About Israel, yes, Israel has its problems from the election and the emergency government that has just been formed, and the annexation policies that it seems embarked upon, which will be an enormous complicator of any settlement of the overall Israel-Palestinian issue. And then you have Hamas in Gaza and the enormous vulnerability because Gaza is one of the most densely populated areas in the world, and all the risks there. It's hard to see how all this will play out, but I see so much instability potential from the fragile political solutions. There is no natural, even though Israel is a democracy in the formal sense, but trends are in the direction of more and more complicated politics, and therefore difficulties in creating national stability. And the Palestinian issue is so far from any kind of solution right now. But it can be triggered. There are two triggers here. One is if there is open warfare between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon, and whether there is the things in Gaza will go out of hand, perhaps as a result of the COVID factor.
And then we haven't even spoken about the authoritarian tendencies which are obviously promoted by the COVID across the continents here, not only in the Western world, but indeed also in Africa. And what I'm worried about now is not least, since I'm also active as an NGO myself, in places, organizations such as Safer World. So the traditional advocacy that you would expect from these organizations, like Amnesty and all these, will be that let's counteract this authoritarian tendencies. Let's focus on more governance, less corruption, and more conflict sensitivity, and what have you. The advocacy is well known and will be only more pronounced given the discussion around COVID-19. But at the same time, what we see obviously is a less and less receptivity on the part of Western governments to support such advocacy. And I really am worried about whether there at all will be money left in the aid budgets from Western states to support NGOs that promote these kind of messages, because it's probably not going to be seen as being the first priority on the part of governments in our own countries, given the dire economic difficulties that they face. We already now know, for instance, that in the EU there have been instructions going out to various units in the various directorate generals in the Commission and so on, to try to find money to liberate for more urgent purposes in the current crisis. This is nothing new. This always happens in a crisis in the EU. But one can only imagine what funds will be found. I have a sort of a feeling that is what is going to be seen as unessential here are things that are actually very, very important from the perspective of governance, development, liberty, freedom, and what have you. Coming back to Henry Kissinger's call for what we have talked about in earlier videos about the potential end of multilateralism, the end threat to the liberal democratic world order. There again, there are links here which are very, very ominous. Any final words from you?
Only to add to this point that what we have to realize is the enormous impact of a situation where all countries are affected by this same factor, in addition to many other problems. This means that there is no safe part that can afford to save the unsafe parts in a sort of a give and take. All countries are affected, and take for example the case of Turkey. It is suffering economically. It was suffering economically even before. Now its tourism industry is affected. Of course, maybe there will be no tourism at all this year. This will mean a loss of $35 billion worth of tourism. Other countries, the export countries of Turkey are being affected also. Therefore, there is a lack of or a plummeting demand affecting Turkish exports, and the same applies to all countries, that there is no fixed ground where to put your feet, but all countries, all players are affected. This makes what we are facing now so profound, and this in turn creates a worldwide temptation to look for crisis solutions, even crisis political solutions, meaning as threats to liberal democracy, because liberal democracy somehow thrives in periods of calm and financed generosity. But now we are dealing with crisis situations of an existential nature. So I'm worried there also that the lead from Orban and others, Erdogan and others will, and Trump to some extent, we have after all elections in the US, and no one knows, as Roger Cohen, for example, wrote in yesterday's New York Times, what kinds of perils are there for the US democracy as well. Its special mechanisms that have not been devised in order to deal with what you see now, and all the negative spirals that we're seeing. So great concern for worry and a lot of impact.
Yeah, and the purpose of these videos, of course, as we have gone through now the multilateral dimension, we've gone through the Russian aspects, we've now looked into the southern dimension, all in relation to the COVID-19 crisis, is of course in the first place to draw attention to these problems, because that's the first necessary condition for action, that people are actually aware of it. Currently one has a feeling that so many people are out there trying to calm the perspectives, try to say that we are going to go through this, it's going to go away and so on. But I think that there is a need for sustained attention to this, and also to the follow-on action necessary. And only on that basis can, even in a realistic world that you are referring to before, only in such a situation will there be enough feeling or perception of joint interest in order to tackle these global threats, and indeed European and indeed Swedish threats. So let's come back to this. Thanks a lot, Michael.